So I want to emphasize that what Blaise and I want to discuss for the next 30 minutes, and then we're going to do 15 minutes of questions, is not what I consider to be the best arguments against abortion and assisted suicide, but what we consider to be, based on tens of thousands of conversations across Canada, to be the most effective arguments against abortion and assisted suicide in a culture that rejects the values that most of us in this room would hold. In short, the arguments we're going to detail have the broadest appeal to the largest number of people. And I always have to say that because sometimes we'll be laying out these arguments and somebody will stick up their hand and like, have you ever heard of Aquinas? Like, there's a better way of wording this. We have, nobody else has, and as such, the arguments that we're introducing you to are going to be much more effective at engaging your peers. All of the arguments we're going to be talking about have actually been used on university students in a campus setting and have been utilized to convert people from the pro-life position, or sorry, that's the other way around, the pro-choice position to the pro-life position. So first, just a very brief summary on how CCBR does our strategy. Some of you will know that we do public outreach on campuses and your high schools, out on the streets, and we do this with a fusion of conversational apologetics, abortion victim photography, and photography of life in the womb. Now, one of the things that I think is very important is for us to understand where our culture is at on these issues. We are a post-liberal, post-enlightenment, very visually driven culture that unfortunately doesn't accept the arguments we prefer to make. I remember at the end of one strategy presentation, a very intelligent man said to me, "I wish that all the young, bright people taking up the torch of the pro-life movement could just go out there and make the really good arguments as opposed to appealing to people through visual images." And my response was, I want that as well, but that's not the country that either of us live in. And as a result, we're forced to meet the culture where they're at and use the best tools at our disposal. I want to make one careful distinction to help people understand why we use imagery. Because a lot of people will say, using imagery has the capacity to turn people off. And it's important to recognize that that's actually the point. But a lot of people look at social reform tactics and confuse them with marketing tactics. Now, a marketing tactic is designed to attract somebody to something. And so there's a lot of right-to-life groups that will put up billboards with, beautiful fat babies that look like they've had extraordinarily blessed lives at 6 months old. And this is designed to make people feel warm and fuzzy, and babies are beautiful, and how could you ever not want somebody who looks like this? But social reform tactics are very different. Social reform tactics are designed to turn people off of things. And so CCBR's tactics are based on careful research of 25 social reform movements starting in the late 1700s. Being mindful of the time here, I won't pause there. With the abolitionist movement, and then taking us all the way to the American Civil Rights Movement and the current campaigns by Amnesty International and a number of other groups. And that's what my book, Seeing is Believing, is about. But a social reform tactic is designed to turn people off. It's the same way a picture of a slave who's been abused is going to inherently turn people off. It's going to create an aversion in them, and that is the point. I still remember my favorite message from a pro-choice leader in Prince Edward Island who liked to send me long, personal, and nasty emails. And in one of them, she said, "I'm so sick of your guys' literature door to door because they keep turning people off of choice." And I thought, I'm going to use that quote in so many presentations because it perfectly illustrates the difference between turning people onto something and turning people off of something. So one final note for anybody who's interested is that the way we test our projects here in Canada is we hire an independent pollster who polls before and after our projects. We've radically changed the way we frame our messaging over the past 10 years because we realized very quickly that images and specific arguments that seemed genius to us in a room filled with people who think like us flopped horribly on the Canadian streets. And so we test all of these and have an independent statistician analyze that data. And so this is fundamentally a data-driven approach. So now before I invite Blaise up to start detailing the human rights argument, I want to just give you the basic framework for how we approach the human rights argument with regard to abortion. Now, we've tried a number of different arguments early on, especially on campuses, and we used to have a primary focus on personhood. The idea that if we can prove the child in the womb is a person, then therefore we can prove that abortion is wrong. What we have found is that the one context, the one framework the vast majority of Canadians still at least have some instinctual understanding of is the idea that human beings get human rights. And they don't even realize their inconsistencies till they're pointed out. So the basic framework of the human rights argument would be human beings get human rights. Human rights begin when the human being begins. Science tells us where human life begins, and as such, the pro-life position and calls for political action on the pro-life issue are merely science and data-driven calls that our law reflect reality, not to mention where the Canadian public is at. Again, I don't find that to be the most convincing argument against abortion, but I have personally seen hundreds and hundreds of people change their mind when presented with the reality that their view of human rights was inconsistent with the duration of a human being's actual life, and especially when presented with facts stating when human life begins, which an astonishing number of people don't know. One encouraging thing about Canada, after a day's worth of depressing analysis, the vast majority of the generation we're interacting with never explicitly rejected the pro-life worldview. They were raised with pro-choice as the default, and so we're no longer fighting with people who used to believe what we believe, changed their mind, and are now ideologically entrenched. We're introducing the pro-life worldview to people who have never heard it before. And young people especially, very, very eager to hear the facts and change their minds, even if they're initially angry. Our polling indicates that women between the ages of 18 and 33 are the most likely to change their mind after interacting with our projects. They, of course, are one of our primary target audiences for obvious reasons. So to get into more details, Blaise.
So I love that Anne of Green Gables disclaimer from earlier, because that is me. I often think about it in terms of Parkinson's law, that the amount of work there is to do will expand to fill the time that is available, and it is the same with me and speaking. Since I have little time available, what this is going to be is a teaser trailer for the apologetics that we use to discuss abortion and euthanasia and assisted suicide. So I just want to give you a brief introduction, and at the end we'll talk about some more resources if you want to go deeper into the apologetics. When I started doing activism at U of T Students for Life, sometimes we would go down on the streets with signs that had slogans like "Abortion kills children" and "Adoption is the loving option." And these things are true. But the problem is they don't show why we believe what we believe. If someone comes to a different conclusion, we don't provide the evidence that they should come to our conclusion, that abortion does kill children. It doesn't show the math. So the first principle in our apologetics is show, don't tell. We need to make visible through photos and through analogies the moral principles that we're trying to communicate. So rather than simply sharing a slogan like "abortion kills children," we need to show the before and the after photos, the photographic evidence that abortion takes a living human being in the womb and decapitates, dismembers, and disembowels them. As Jonathon mentioned, at the core of our apologetics is what we call the human rights argument. And it's a few simple questions that we introduce as early as we can in a conversation about abortion, and that we use as the anchor of that conversation. So we keep bringing it back to this framework because it summarizes the entire pro-life position. I was doing activism at Ryerson probably 2-3 years ago at the corner of Church and Gould in downtown Toronto, walking distance from here. And I was holding a couple signs with photos very much like that. And a man drove by on an electric wheelchair, stopped, reversed, came back, and unloaded on me. He said, "Why are you showing this stuff on the streets?" And he didn't use the word stuff. And he said a whole bunch of other things, and I listened to him for a moment. And when I had a chance, he said if abortion was murder, it would be illegal. And when I had a chance to ask him a question, I said, "Sir, can I ask you, do you believe in human rights?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, who do you think should get human rights?" He said, "Well, everyone." I said, "I agree. Right? All human beings should get human rights." Now, if two human beings reproduce, what species is their offspring? And truth be told, he said, I don't know, I'm gay. And I said, okay, well, what do you think a biology textbook would say, even if we don't have personal experience? And he says, well, human. I said, okay, right. So if human rights are for all human beings and humans reproduce other humans, doesn't it logically follow that to take a living human being and to do this to them, and I gestured to the photo that I was holding, is a human rights violation? And he looked down at the photo and he started nodding his head. And I explained to him that we were showing the photos because as long as it's happening behind closed doors, people don't understand the reality that there are living human beings who are being killed by the action of abortion. And he nodded and he said, you're right. And he apologized and he thanked me and went on his way. Now those simple questions, thank you. I mean, it's not me, it's the truth. And those simple questions help to draw it out in the most efficient way, right? Are human rights for some of us or for all of us, right? Do you believe in human rights? Who gets them? If two human beings reproduce, what species is their offspring? And then connecting the dots. Doesn't it logically follow that if human rights for all human beings, to do this to another human being, described with your words or with a photo, is a human rights violation? So that's the core of our apologetics. I want to share with you just a couple other perspectives, tools or perspectives on abortion apologetics here. In all of our responses, we do something called common ground analogy question. We just drill that into our mind. So whenever somebody says anything, we are thinking, how can I start with common ground, where I agree, use some kind of analogy or story to illustrate the point, and then ask a question to get someone else thinking, because they're going to remember what they thought more than what I said. So for example, somebody says, I think it's a woman's body, her choice. I'll say, I agree with you that people should have choices. Choices are good, right? Choosing what to have for lunch or what to study in school, that is a good thing. Now, if somebody chose to have a drink and then get behind the wheel of a car, would that be a problem? Somebody's going to say, yes, well, of course. And why? Well, because you could hurt somebody else. And we can use that to bring it back to abortion. But see the model of the response. Common ground, an analogy or a story to illustrate the point, and then asking a question. Because when we come at people with our conclusions or our slogans, they have their shields up. They're less likely to listen than if we can start with where we agree and illustrate the point and ask questions that get people thinking. And when we're talking about a sensitive issue like abortion, it's important to recognize that it is not just about the intellectual arguments, but often about the emotional blocks that can prevent someone from accepting the pro-life position. Whether that's personal experience with abortion or whether that's a bad experience with adoption or something else that is an emotional block. So Aristotle says that effective communication is ethos, pathos, and logos, which in English you could say is character, empathy, and then the logic or the truth or the message. And as Mortimer Adler puts it, first, like the order matters. First, we need to build the bridge, then touch the heart, and then and only then can we deliver the message. Right? If we want to reach the person and not just win the argument, that common ground analogy question, or building a bridge with the kind of real, authentic person-to-person experiences that we've been talking about all through the conference this weekend. Building rapport with the person that you're speaking with. And then showing empathy for the situation they're in, using stories and analogies to touch the heart. And then and only then can people be receptive to the message. So that is just a brief preview of the perspective we take when entering into these conversations. I'll share more at the end about resources that are available to learn more, but I just want to play a short video for you with a few testimonies. These are just from a few weeks from our summer interns a few years ago, just a sample of a few weeks of conversations that they had when they put this into practice on the streets in the Greater Toronto area.
While doing Choice Chain, I was holding an image of an 11-week-old aborted child. 2 boys walked up to me and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "This is what an abortion looks like." I then asked them if they believed in human rights, and they said, "Of course we do." And after talking about human rights for a bit, they both agreed that an abortion is a human rights violation because it kills a child, and they walked away completely pro-life.
I was doing Choice Chain at the high school in Calgary, and in the span of a lunch hour, I literally spoke to 35 students who had never thought about the issue of abortion before, and by the end of my conversations with them, every single one of them realized that abortion was a human rights violation.
While doing Choice Chain in downtown Windsor, I spoke to a woman named Christine, who shared with me that she thought abortion was wrong in all cases except for sexual assault. And she then mentioned how she just left the courthouse where she was dealing with her own sexual assault case, and she wasn't sure if she was pregnant or not. So Christine wanted to know, what did I think about that? I told Christine how valuable her life is and how we as a society need to do more to care for women like her who have been through such a traumatizing experience. I then showed her how valuable the life of the preborn child was as well, and that they are deserving of their human rights. Christine smiled at me and said, "Wow, you really struck a chord in me." We shook hands and she went on her way.
Not knowing that Hannah had already spoke to her, I asked her again what she thought about abortion. While motioning across the street, she said, "Hannah changed my mind," and she went on her way.
While doing activism, I asked a woman walking by what she thought about abortion. She then pointed to a cute little boy in her stroller. She told me that she was going to get an abortion, but chose not to after seeing our signs and talking with us. Little Noah is alive today because his mother saw what abortion really does to preborn children.
I was recently doing activism in downtown Hamilton when a young woman approached me and said, "I saw you guys here last week and I was going to get an abortion, but after seeing the pictures of aborted children, I changed my mind. I'm keeping my child."
Those might seem like very carefully selected stories, but actually it's so common to see people change their minds after outreach now that the funniest testimony I ever read, because we get all of our interns to write down a synopsis of their conversations afterwards, was Carrie Lynn, who said she was just so sick of writing down all these stories, so she just wrote pro-choice Dylan, human rights argument, pro-life Dylan. And that was the entirety of the testimony she'd done. So I'm mindful that it's 2:50 and I want to get through some arguments, so I'm now going to do my very famous imitation of an auctioneer on cocaine, so I can get through most of the rest of this and then let Blaise end it with some of the arguments on the human rights argument as it applies to assisted suicide. So when the assisted suicide debate started here in Canada, again, there was a lot of really great philosophical defenses of the pro-life position. There was a lot of people speaking up with essential information. But what we found was we didn't have any arguments that we could use to relate to university students, to teenagers, to people who never think about these issues in language that was immediately accessible to, a 17, 18, 19-year-old. And so we started actually by debating each other for 3 or 4 months, back and forth, trying to tear apart each other's arguments. Once we had arguments that we thought worked pretty effectively on each other, we started to actually go out and debate university students on them. Any argument that could take somebody from pro-assisted suicide to anti-assisted suicide in less than 20 minutes was included. Eventually, we ended up with a fairly succinct system for how to debate this. To start off with, most of the previous talks have actually emphasized what I was going to say, so I can just quickly summarize as opposed to laying it out, is we had noticed that in every debate, there's always a word people try to avoid. So with the abortion debate, they actually are trying to avoid the word abortion, right? That's why they say pro-choice. They say a woman's right to choose, but they don't finish their sentence. A woman's right to choose what? When it came to this debate, it was the word suicide. Because no matter how hard you try, nobody's going to think suicide is beautiful, and everybody knows somebody who has struggled with suicidal ideation at one point or another, who may have attempted it, thought about it, and at the end of the day, in order to mainstream dying with dignity, which means you have to die faster, you had to get rid of the word suicide. I remember the month when they switched from physician-assisted dying to MAID, and noticing, wait a second, the CBC is now calling it MAID, what is this? And I went back and all these different outlets. I would love to know how they coordinated that, but over a span of a couple of weeks, all of the language changed almost overnight. And so first, as the last speaker pointed out, is we need to discuss this in terms of suicide. Because the fundamental question of this debate is not about the right to die or autonomy. The fundamental questions that we ask people to illustrate the fact that this has nothing to do with rights is it really boils down to who gets suicide prevention and who gets suicide assistance. If this was just about choice or autonomy, we wouldn't live in a system where the government actually draws the red line between two populations and makes that choice. Because if I walk into a doctor's office and I go through my mental health history and my medical history and I request assisted suicide, they're going to tell me no. I don't qualify for it. I'm too healthy. Therefore, the only thing they offer me is suicide prevention. I'm not actually eligible to get assistance in killing myself. Any number of my family members, including my father, who has spoken publicly about his own journey with depression, could walk into the same office, talk to the same doctor. They would go through the criteria, and they would say, actually, you are eligible to kill yourself. And a country that pretends I am equal to him when I can access this and he cannot, based on a line that was not decided by myself or himself, but was instead decided by the government, is lying about what equality actually is. And I think that is the argument we have found when discussing with university students so compelling, is when you point out that you don't actually get to pick. The government has created two categories of human beings. One category of human beings can kill themselves whenever they're ready. The other set of human beings cannot kill themselves and will only be able to access suicide prevention. This keenly offends people's basic sense of justice, and it was the first argument we saw consistently change people's minds in a very short amount of time. The idea that by actually legislating for this, the very act of putting guidelines is the government deciding, making a decision, whose life is worth saving and whose life is not. Whose life is so worthwhile that we will give them suicide prevention? Whose life is so worthless we will fund their suicide and defend their right to have a doctor assist them in doing so? Now back to Blaise.
So to put this in practice and take all of the insights, all of the evidence, and put it into a format that anybody could use in conversation. As Jonathan mentioned, we sparred with each other, but I also went with my colleagues at U of T Students for Life and Toronto Against Abortion to the streets at U of T in Ryerson for about an hour a week for over a year as we were preparing for this book to test out all the arguments. And we threw a whole bunch of them out and we included new ones. And the way that we decided to start a conversation, to anchor a conversation, the human rights argument equivalent for end-of-life issues, is another set of simple questions. We'd ask somebody, what do you think about suicide? And obviously the response from almost everyone is going to be, well, I think that's horrible. We need to do more to support mental health in society, and recognizing that there is a problem and a tragedy. And the second question is, what do you think about assisted suicide? And suddenly you get a very different answer from the average person. And then we put it all together with the key question that Jonathan mentioned at the heart of the debate. If somebody is suicidal, how do we decide whether they should get suicide prevention or suicide assistance? Right? Because our society believes in preventing suicide and promoting suicide. And there are only three ways to answer the question. The most common view is what we call the split position, that we should assist some suicides and prevent others. And the problem with this is it creates a fundamentally unequal society where we are deciding whose lives we would defend and whose lives we would end, who we think is better off alive, who we think is better off dead. We are splitting society into two classes rather than giving everyone an equal right to suicide prevention. Well, some people might respond to me like, okay, well, I guess everyone should get a right to suicide then. We call this the total choice position. And the problem with this position is that almost no one believes it. A few simple questions like, is suicide ever a tragedy? Should we ever try to prevent suicide? With a few simple questions like this, we can split the total choice position because almost everyone believes in suicide prevention for at least some people. And then the third and last remaining option is the pro-life position, that suicide prevention is always the answer. And for people to accept that, we need to rule out the other two positions first. And we need to be able to share some of what you learned today about mental health, about dignity-conserving care and dignity therapy, and share some of that in accessible terms so they can see another alternative. So just changing the frame of the debate and pitting the suicide prevention against suicide promotion goes a long way to challenging people's perspectives. And then throughout the book that we wrote, we go into a lot more detail about how you can communicate the pro-life message and respond to particular objections and share some of the data and share some of the stories. In an earlier presentation, a quote from Dr. B.J. Miller's TED Talk was mentioned, what really matters at the end of life. And I want to share just the last few minutes of his TED Talk for anyone who hasn't seen it. The whole 18 minutes is worthwhile. But as we rule out the split position and the total choice position, the appeal to creative and imaginative solutions that are needed to deal with the reality of death and dying can help show people that there is another way.
Where caring becomes a creative, generative, even playful act. Play may sound like a funny word here, but it's also one of our highest forms of adaptation. Consider every major compulsory effort it takes to be human. The need for food is birth cuisine. The need for shelter has given rise to architecture. The need for cover, fashion. And for being subjected to the clock, well, we invented music. So, since dying is a necessary part of life, what might we create with this fact? By play, I am in no way suggesting that we take a light approach to dying or that we mandate any particular way of dying. There are mountains of sorrow that cannot move, and one way or another, we will all kneel there. Rather, I am asking we make space, physical, psychic room, to allow life to play itself all the way out, so that rather than just getting out of the way, aging and dying can become a process of crescendo through to the end. We can't solve for death. I know some of you are working on this. Meanwhile, we can design towards it. Now, parts of me died early on, and that's something we can all say one way or another. I got to redesign my life around this fact, and I tell you, it has been a liberation to realize you can always find a shock of beauty or meaning in what life you have left. Like that snowball, lasting for a perfect moment, all the while melting away. If we love such moments ferociously, then maybe we can learn to live well, not in spite of death, but because of it. Let death be what takes us, not lack of imagination. Thank you.
When someone's having a heart attack, you don't call the nutritionist, right? They need a paramedic, they might need emergency care. But once the emergency is past, probably be a good idea for them to see their family doc, to try and explore what may have led to this emergency situation. The kind of apologetics that we're talking about here is an emergency response to a culture that has forgotten about love, but still understands rights. We can appeal to human rights to make the case to protect the vulnerable and meet people where they're at in the culture. Even though there is also a lot of important work to be done, take Friday night's talk and the deep kind of anthropology and understanding of what it means to be human. That's so important, but that's the long-term health and wellness kind of approach. So with the apologetics, our focus is we know people believe in science and human rights. We can use that common ground to make the case against abortion. We know people believe in suicide prevention and human equality. We can use that common ground to make the case against euthanasia and assisted suicide. This was just a teaser trailer. If you want to learn more about it, we have our book Stuck on Anti-Abortion Apologetics and a guide to discussing assisted suicide. And we have a bunch of copies at the back. And for anyone in this room today, if you will commit to us that you will read one of these from cover to cover, you can have it for free. So we'll be at the back there. I've got a box of them. If you want to learn more, grab the book, or at prolifeguys.com, there's a podcast where you can learn more about apologetics as well. But hopefully this introduces you to how we have these conversations in the most efficient and effective ways that we can. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All right, changing the frame of the debate. Can I have a seat? Oh, I wanted to sit in one of these chairs. Oh, that's great. Oh, that feels good. Okay, I'll be back in about 5 minutes. We've got a few questions. But I first want to just, a line that I hadn't heard before, die with dignity, please die faster. You know, you talked about that. That die with dignity really means please die faster. What inspired you? Where did that come from? Was that yours, or where did that come from?
Yeah, no, that one was mine. It comes from the discussions I was having with people about assisted suicide and what their version of dignity was. Was that because to say dying with dignity means you get assisted suicide means that those who don't apply for it aren't dying with dignity, right? It means my grandfather's body slowly fell apart over 6 weeks. Right? Did his life and his death have any less dignity towards the end than somebody who decided to get a lethal injection early on? And so I started challenging people with that. And because, again, it's not particularly academic, it works with people. They're like, oh, I guess I am sort of insinuating that in order to die with dignity, I have to die faster. I have to die before I am incontinent. I have to die before I depend on somebody. I have to die before any number of these things. So that's the inherent assumption of it. And I found it very effective in talking with people.
Blaise, I know in my travels and doing the films a few years ago, it always amazed me whatever parliament, whatever lobby, whatever rally was going on, it was a disability rights movement that were at the front and center at all of the debates, as was the church, rightfully so. But can you speak to that? Can you speak to, especially, this is very powerful. Can you also remind me of the name of that person, because I hadn't seen that before?
Dr. B.J. Miller,
Thank you.
TED Talk at the end, yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about the split position that most people hold, right, that some people should get suicide prevention and some people should get suicide promotion, it is the elderly and people with disabilities who usually get the short end of the stick. We talk about in the book breaking down the reasons why people in our society will quit on others and abandon them to suicidal despair. QUIT being an acronym, taken in reverse order: T for terminal prognosis, I for incurable condition, U for unbearable pain or suffering, and Q for quality of life. And around a lot of these issues, I mean, even when you're talking terminal prognosis, they're disability issues, whether they're kind of capital D disabilities or the kind of disability issues that we all may face at a different age or stage in life. And that split to deny an equal right to suicide prevention is usually for people with disabilities or people who are elderly. So pointing that out makes a big difference in conversation, because people by default think they're taking a more compassionate approach to people with disabilities. And when you can point out with a few questions that it's actually a lethal form of ableism, people get very uncomfortable with the opinions that they confidently stated 30 seconds prior.
I would want to die if I was in a wheelchair, is basically what it sounds like to be.
Right. Well, we'll go to the questions here. I was actually just thinking of Amy Hasbrook, who's I think it's Ain't Dead Yet or Not Dead Yet organization. She's just amazing advocate, and she says, it's not an us and them situation, and she suffers with PSD, blindness, and a number of other issues, but very outspoken, amazing woman. And she says, it's not an us and them situation, it's an all of us situation, because we're all one step away from being disabled or are disabled in some way, whether it's psychological or illness or will be happen tomorrow. And when you think about it in that framework, as you just said, it's real, gives you pause for thought. Okay, here we go. Here comes a question. David asks, what percentage of 18 to 33-year-olds are pro-life? Add to that, does anybody know what percent of med students, physicians are pro-life? Is there a...
So I can't tell you how many are pro-life because none of the data we have from any of the 4 major pollsters who have polled on this issue actually defined the term pro-life, which is why the polling we do is very specific to what your view on abortion is. There are a lot of people who identify as pro-choice but are miles away from the position of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, and there are many people who identify as pro-life who are pretty far away from the position most of us in this room would hold. And so we always find when somebody says, oh, I'm pro-life, when they're talking to us on the streets, we always ask if they have any exceptions, because a lot of people do, and for a lot of people, it's rape, incest, and mine. In other words, there's always a way they can find to justify an abortion that they want to have, and so it's often a conversation is often necessary. I can tell you what our data looks like. Those who interact with our projects, females between the ages of 18 and early 30s is just over 50% of people shift towards a pro-life position on a scale of 1 to 5. Those who interact with so again, this depends on where you are. Heavily immigrant communities who just receive the literature and look at it. We hired a polling agency who polled 6 months apart to make sure that their views actually remain stable rather than evaporating a week after they got the literature. They had over 65% of people move towards a pro-life position. The whiter the neighborhood gets, the lower your success rate is. So if you do it in Hamilton or Oakville, that number decreases to about between 38 and 42%. And those are just 2 of many data sets. But what we find is a lot of new Canadians are instinctively pro-life, they're instinctively anti-abortion, they're instinctively horrified by the idea of assisted suicide or euthanasia, because most of them live in 3-generation households. And so most of the polling data in this country is total garbage. It does not actually reflect the reality on the ground. So the good news is way more people think like us than you'd think. The bad news is we have no accurate way of measuring that at this point.
And at the other end of the spectrum, I'm not sure whether you found this before, but you've got pro-lifers who say, oh yeah, absolutely, especially because you do a lot of speaking at churches. Oh yeah, absolutely, I'm pro-life on the baby end. We should not kill babies, we shouldn't kill them in the womb. But when it comes to euthanasia or medical aid in dying or any of the euphemisms, they say something like, well, I can't really make an accurate judgment on that because I might be in that position one day, and I just, and so they waffle, and you can understand why, because we might be in that position. I don't want to make a determination on that. Do you face that?
Yeah, I think many pro-lifers who are against euthanasia and assisted suicide don't know how to defend their position. But then there are also many people who might be very open to the pro-life position, but they've never really thought it through. And they've heard the other side. But what we found powerful by pitting the suicide prevention against suicide promotion is it challenges people and makes people think through their position, probably for the first time ever, I'd say, for 8 of the 10 people I talk to on the streets about the issue. So there are a lot of people, I think, in the pews who might be pro-life on abortion and leaning to be in favor of assisted suicide because they haven't thought it through. But a very quick conversation to challenge them can make a very big difference.
So true.
One slight addition to that, and in addition to what was said in the last session, where people always ask you if you're defending human rights of any kind, oh, you must be Christian, which I take as an inadvertent compliment. But one of the things, especially in one-on-one conversations, that I have found very effective is that if they won't get off asking me what my exact views from a religious or metaphysical perspective are, I always ask them why they think that only religious people can have a consistent view of human rights and a consistent dedication to suicide prevention. And that has stopped a lot of people in their tracks, because they don't realize it's actually a compliment that when I say you shouldn't kill babies in the womb, we should only offer suicide prevention, that their assumption is that I'm a Christian. And if they think that only Christians can hold those views, maybe I have a whole bunch of views that they might want to reconsider.
I think, yeah, that was very good. I think one of the greatest, I won't say compliments, but when you do travel and you speak, I had one gentleman say to me, he said, thank you for shifting me out of neutral. And this was in Australia, in Yass, a little town called Yass. And out of all the talks, it was like, man, thank you for shifting me out of neutral. I think it's neutrality and maybe you could speak to this, is neutrality, especially because we're talking about human rights here, neutrality leads to one or the other. And in most cases, countries that are neutral end up going for these laws, euthanasia laws. Can you speak to neutrality?
I mean, sometimes people say, well, maybe we should agree to disagree, and we will respond, well, we can agree that we disagree. But this is a critically important question, right? Because if there's only one body involved in a pregnancy, then I'm a total jerk telling women what to do with their own bodies. But if there is a second body who is being decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled, discarded as medical waste, then I think we should all be concerned and be standing up for the rights of the most vulnerable in society. It's a really important question, and being neutral doesn't make sense given what's at stake.
That's good. One question, are we okay with one more question? Okay. Amanda asks, when you ask who deserves suicide prevention versus suicide facilitation, how do you respond to the most common response which is whoever themselves wants it?
So that's what we call sort of revealing the reason, because if that were true, that it should be up to the individual person, then any act of suicide prevention would be an infringement on their rights, right? Because suicide prevention is intervening when somebody wants to cause themselves harm and trying to get in the way of that, right? So when we say that some people should get suicide prevention and some people should get suicide assistance, there is inevitably a triage, right? There is somebody else making a judgment call on who fits into what categories. If it was really about personal choice, then everyone would have the right and suicide prevention wouldn't be a thing.
Okay, that was so succinct, we got time for one more. That was great. I'm not sure, I think this was Judith who sent this, and I just lost it here.
Hey, Judith.
Getting back to the whole idea of human rights, I have been told by a judge / professor that the personhood and viability of the fetus is an impossible legal question. How do you discuss the personhood of the fetus when people avoid the topic altogether or deflect the topic to a woman's constitutional right to abortion, which of course doesn't even exist in Canada, but that's beside.
Viability isn't a legal question, it's a medical question. So he's trying to make a judgment call that's outside his pay grade, which is first. And he should be relying on people who actually understand medical ethics in the context of preborn human life. It's the same mistake that the judges made on Roe. So often when people say, well, we can't know X, they say, I don't know X, or more specifically, I refuse to research X because the information I find may be inconvenient to my position. On personhood, the fastest way to do it, and I had an argument with an atheist philosophy major on a major university campus, and they're the worst to talk to. Because nothing degrades intelligence like a philosophy degree on a mainstream campus. And so we're having this back and forth on what kind of society we want to live in. And he keeps on going back to personhood, but he keeps on flipping where he wants personhood to land. And finally, I pointed out, if all human beings are to remain safe, the only consistent place to put personhood is at the beginning of the human being's life. Because, of course, women were once denied legal personhood, African Americans were, Jews were. Go through the list. Whenever you remove personhood from a human being, we end up with tragedy, as is happening in abortion. And the closest I could get him after 20 minutes was, I will admit I'd rather live in a society guided by that framework than mine, but I still think I'm right.
I'll just say that I did a philosophy minor, but but I've also spoken to enough philosophy students on campus that I can second that.
Jonathon Van Maren, Blaise Alleyne, thank you very much. You guys are the William Wilberforces of our day, and we thank you for your witness.